Good day, I'm Shannon Farrell with the OSU Department of Agricultural Economics, and this is part of our video series about farm transition planning. Now, before you even start the farm transition planning process, what you're probably thinking is, why is having a farm transition plan so important? And that's the purpose of this video, is to kind of lay out some of the reasons why a farm transition plan can really help you increase the odds of your farm staying together and staying in the family for generations to come. Now, when we talk about this concept, it's really important to understand how the odds are really stacked against us in having a successful transition of a farm to the next generation. But if you look at the research, it shows that there are three primary reasons why we actually have a fairly low success rate in America of keeping farms and other small family-owned businesses together. The first of those is inadequate estate planning. The second of those is insufficient capitalization for the business, and the third is a failure to prepare that next generation to really take on the role that they'll have when it becomes their turn to run that business. And when we look at this, this is really underlined by the poor job generally we do as a country when we're talking about things like estate planning. Inadequate estate planning being that first reason that we saw so many of these businesses fail to make that generational transfer. 55% of American adults have no form of estate planning in place whatsoever. And you would think that in agriculture we'd actually be doing better, but the fact is we're actually doing worse. 64% of farm and agribusiness owners don't have any form of estate planning in place. Furthermore, 88% of farmers and ranchers have no retirement plan in place. And you may be asking yourself, what does a retirement plan have to do with me successfully transferring my farm to the next generation? But as we're going to see over the course of this series, and as you work through the farm transition workbook, having a retirement plan in place is actually an integral part of your farm transition plan overall, because you have to provide some sort of way of supporting perhaps multiple generations with your farm business. Now, the reason that all this is really important and why I think you really care about farm transition planning is because of the numbers that show the success rate that we have in transferring farms and other small businesses from one generation to the next. The numbers indicate that to transfer a business from the founding generation to the next generation, we're going to see 30% of those businesses survive, and the rest are going to go by the wayside. That's less than a third of those farms and small businesses making just one generational transfer. If you take that one step further to a second generational transfer, that number drops to 12%, and you go one generation further, that number drops to 3%. Those numbers are really, really small. So we really need to do a better job of looking long term and having a better transition plan in place to increase those odds. Now, another reason that this is really important for us is because the first person probably that's going to either benefit or suffer from the job that we've done in our transition plan is going to be a surviving spouse. And statistically, 80% of surviving spouses are going to be the wife involved. So if we care about those spouses, and most of the time it's going to be statistically our wives, we really have to do a good job of transition planning, because they're going to be the first ones to deal with that. And that's reflected in the poverty statistics for surviving spouses. Widowed females are 3 to 4 times more likely to be below the poverty line than their married counterparts of the same age. And that's because they've again been the victim of being the first person to suffer at the hands of a bad transition plan, which, like we said, over half of Americans have no plan at all in place. So these numbers are really sobering. But if we step back and look even at the larger scale, we have to realize that succession planning and transition planning are things that we have to tackle, because we don't have forever to put these sorts of things off. The graph that you're seeing right now shows the population of the United States. And as you can kind of see, there's a bubble when we look at the population in 2000 that's bracketed there. That's the baby boom. And that's where the baby boom was in terms of age at the time of the 2000 census. Now, if we move forward to the 2010 census, we see again that bubble, the baby boom, has started to age. And if we project that forward to 2020, we see that that number is starting to narrow, that bubble's getting smaller. That's because at this point in time, many of our baby boomers are approaching retirement age, and as we go forward another 10 years, lots of our baby boomers will start reaching the mortality stage. All of this is to say that we can't put off transition planning. It's something that we really need to tackle right now. But what if you choose not to tackle this plan? What could happen if you don't have any sort of plan in place for the succession of your farm whatsoever? Well, let's take a look at an example that involves what we would call a complex family. In other words, a family where there's been previous marriages and children from those previous marriages. So let's assume that Mike marries Carol. okay, and that Mike has 3 kids from a previous marriage, Greg, Peter, and Bobby, and that Carol has kids from a previous marriage, Marcia, Jan, and Cindy. Now, it's not uncommon for us in agriculture to have a hired hand, and so let's say that these folks have a hired hand named Alice, and she's been working for below market wage. We don't feel that our farm's been profitable enough to pay her what the market would pay her, but we've promised Alice that in our estate plan, we'll include her so she'll get a piece of the farm, and that will kind of be her compensation. We often call that sweat equity in the field of our investigation here. Now, Mike dies unexpectedly. He passed away. He didn't have any sort of estate plan in place. What's going to happen to his farm? Well, to answer that question, first off, we have to figure out what portion of his assets were acquired after he was married and what portion of his assets were acquired before he was married. And this obviously varies a great deal depending on the age of the person at their second marriage, how many assets they'd accumulated, what their career had looked like prior to that point. But if we assume that most of the farm assets were property that he acquired after he got married to Carol, well, then the way that this is going to look under the default rules, the intestate succession rules in Oklahoma, Carol would be entitled to half of the assets that were acquired after marriage. And then Mike's kids, Greg, Peter, and Bobby, would divide the remaining half amongst themselves. In this case, they would each get a third of that half, or 1/6 of the total amount of the assets. Now, if this farm was just at the size necessary to support this family, we've got some real problems here, because Carol only has half the farm, and each of the 3 boys would be perfectly entitled to take their share of the farm, sell it to an outside interest, or just sell it outright. So is half of the farm going to be enough to support Carol and the remaining family members? But that's one scenario. What if most of what Mike had acquired with respect to the farm had been acquired before he'd gotten married? Well, now if we're talking about non-marital assets, non-joint assets, now Carol is on the exact same footing with Greg, Peter, and Bobby. They all split the non-marital assets equally. So in this case, everyone would have 1/4 of the farm. And again, that may not be enough to sustain any one of them. So if our goal was to keep the farm together and keep the family farming, not having a plan is likely not going to work. Furthermore, look who's not pictured in this scene. None of the girls have received anything, and Mike may not have wanted that to be the case. Alice hasn't received anything for the years of service that she was giving and promise of receiving a piece of the farm. So we've got some real problems here. So remember the old saying that in not choosing you have chosen? If you choose not to pursue some sort of transition plan for your farm, there's a plan in place. It's called the intestate succession rules, and it might bring about results that you just don't want to have. So then, who needs to have a transition plan? Well, our argument is everyone. Everyone needs some form of transition plan, if for no other reason that you can direct where your property goes and kind of take some charge of how you want to see the future of your farm play out. Now, people that are especially vulnerable to not having a transition plan are young families. Young families are probably in the process of growing their farming operation. They may have a higher debt amount than more mature operators, and so that puts them at more peril for not having enough assets to cover those debts. Furthermore, they need to have provisions in place for taking care of their young children if those children aren't of the age of 18 yet. Now, in the same vein as young families, if farms are just at the point of becoming self-sustaining, in other words, if the farm's just big enough that it can support the family without having to have external sources of income, if that farm gets broken up, now we're back below that line of being viable, and that puts that farm at risk. Farms with limited asset liquidity. And when we say that, what we mean is that they have a lot of assets, but those assets may not be converted to cash quickly. And the classic example of this is land. If we've got a farm that has a lot of land and other assets that may be valuable, but we can't sell quickly, that can put us in a bind if someone should pass away, because there may be end-of-life expenses such as medical expenses, funeral expenses, unpaid debts. And if we can't convert those estate assets quickly into cash, we really put the surviving family members into a bind. And like we just demonstrated, complex families are going to have a really tough time unless the transition's plan in place, just because there are lots of variables that we can't account for otherwise. Now, hopefully we've convinced you that having a transition plan is really important, but we're not going to try to convince you that it's easy, because it's not. There are lots of tough decisions that have to be made, lots of conversations that have to be had, and there are just some factors that make it a little more challenging for us in agriculture. Let's take a look at a farm-owning family. Maybe they're not from Oklahoma, but they do own a lot of farm land. Now in this scenario, we've got Mom, who pretty much calls the shots. She's running the show, but she believes that she can do a better job running the farm operation than anyone else. Well, the thing about it is Mom's 88, okay? Now her husband, Dad, tries to help out, but he's 93, and he's had some health problems lately. It's been tough for him to try to really contribute to the operation, and he could probably stand to have a little bit of a break from the day-to-day grind. Well, what they could do is they could transfer day-to-day control to their son, who's now age 66, but he's retirement age himself, and he may not be willing to take on another job already when he wants to kind of actually start retiring and slowing down a bit. Furthermore, the child's shown a little bit of questionable judgment, and Mom and Dad aren't quite sure they're ready to turn the reins over to the kid just yet. Well, if that's the case, then we could look at the grandson, but the grandson's 32. Now he's eager, he's excited, he's worked hard, he's got a university degree in agriculture, so he really wants to grow into the operation someday, but he may not be ready to take on the overall management of the operation on a day-to-day basis quite yet. And so this kind of generational pinching that we see happens a lot in agriculture. The agricultural operation is still the major source of income for Mom and Dad. They don't feel comfortable turning it over to anyone else because they don't know that they can do as good of a job running the farm, or they're worried that they're not going to be able to generate the cash flow they need to support Mom and Dad. And so what we see is this generational compression where sometimes generations may even be skipped, or generations are thrown into management at the point in time when they'd probably want to retire themselves. So this is just one of the challenges that we face in agriculture. Now, another challenge that we face is because our asset base for personal use and for business use many times is one and the same. And if we weren't talking about agriculture, if we were talking about someone who'd been a successful businessman elsewhere and they wanted to come to a transition plan, what many professionals would say is, first off, we're going to take the business assets and the personal assets and sort of separate them out. And for the business assets, what we're going to do is create a succession plan. We're going to figure out who in the business has the talent to grow into management and gradually over time groom them for that role in the day they eventually take it over. And we're going to use those business assets to generate some retirement income for the founder and make that part of their personal asset portfolio. And when we talk about the personal assets, what we talk about is an estate and gift plan. In other words, how are you going to receive, invest, and enjoy those assets until you pass away? How will you gift them away during life if you want to, or how you transfer ownership of those assets after you've passed away. So those are two separate processes, but like we said, in agriculture, our asset base is usually combined. And so what we really need to do is unite the succession planning process and the estate planning process into what we call the transition process. So we look holistically at both of these processes, put them together, and come up with a transition plan that works both for our business interests in the farm and for our personal interests in it as well. Remember though, this is tough for us in agriculture because the family may also rely on the asset base to support their living needs, so it may not be just the personal assets of the person that we're talking about. And the business assets may also be the thing that we intend to pass on to our kids, but we also need it to support us in retirement. And all of these things work together to make this a really complex problem that we kind of have to work on piece by piece. Now, for those that are brave enough to tackle the transition planning process, there are real benefits to be gained. And to kind of illustrate how this process works, let's take a look at the lifetime of a farm over multiple generations. And let's say that we actually do have a successful transition plan so that the farm actually does stay intact over these generations. Now, what likely happens though is that each generation, as we grow value of the farm, at the death of one of the founders, we probably transfer those assets to a child, and there's probably one or more children that say, I care about the farm, but I want to work somewhere else. I'm not going to come back and run the farm, so I need to sell my assets to either one of the on-farm heirs or to someone else, okay? So with each passing generation, a chunk of the value of the farm is taken out of the system, whether it's because we have to refinance, to mortgage or purchase the interest of the off-farm heirs, or just because those interests get sold to someone else entirely. We kind of set ourselves back with each generational transfer. Well, if you look at that, then over 4 generations, you kind of see what the value of the farm looks like here. But consider for a moment, if we had a good transition plan that allowed even the off-farm heirs to get some value out of their asset base without us having to remortgage all the assets we already purchased, and we projected that growth over time, see what the value of our farm could be over those 4 generations if we had good succession and good transition planning in place with each of those generations. That's something to get excited about, and hopefully that motivates you to have a really good transition plan in place. Now, we said this is going to be a tough process, but that's okay. The purpose of this video series and the Farm Transitions Workbook is to take you step by step through the things that you can do to actually have a successful transition plan in place. Now, we kind of divide the transition planning process into 5 basic steps. First off, you need to determine where you're at right now. Create an inventory of all the assets that your farm business has. And we're not just talking about land and equipment and cattle and other forms of livestock. What we're talking about is those assets plus your human assets. Who's involved? Who wants to be involved? Who may not want to be involved? Before we figure out where we're going, we have to figure out where we are. And so that's step 1, figuring out our inventory and where we're at in the transition planning process right now. Step 2 is actually communicating with all of the stakeholders. And the stakeholders in our business are the people that rely on it for their livelihood, our family, and people that have an emotional investment in our farm. So that includes people that may want to come back to the farm or people that may want to pursue their livelihoods elsewhere. But everyone who has any form of stake, whether it's financial, managerial, or emotional, those are all stakeholders, and we need to get all of them involved. We need to have buy-in from those stakeholders if our transition plan is to succeed. The next step is to develop a business succession plan. Like we talked about, it's important for us to treat the farm like a business and develop a succession plan. How is this farm business going to successfully move from its current operators, its current management, to the people that are going to manage it and operate it in the future? And we need to figure out a way to make that process smoothly rather than perhaps jumping all at once to that future state when someone passes away. A gradual transfer has been shown to greatly increase our odds of success. Now, at the same time, we also talked about the importance of estate planning, and so we need to have a good estate plan in place. We're going to examine in this series why wills are important, how other documents for estate planning can play a vital role, and we'll talk about the role of trusts and life insurance as other optional tools that might be useful to us as well. Once we've done all that, then we have to have an actual implementation plan. We've got the plans in place. Now, how do we start taking the next steps into actually putting those plans into action? So those are the 5 steps of transition planning that we'll be talking about both in our videos and in the workbook series. So to review what we've talked about today, we've mentioned the 3 principal reasons that we see generational transfers of farms fail: inadequate estate planning, insufficient capitalization, and a lack of preparation for that next generation. We've talked about the reasons that those 3 factors can really put family members at risk if we don't have a good transition plan in place. We've talked about the fact that everyone needs a plan, and we've talked about the challenges of that plan, but we're going to work through those together. And last but certainly not least, we talked about the 5 steps of that transition plan. And it's those 5 steps that the rest of this video series is going to cover. Now, if at any point in time you want to watch this video again, if you want to download the Farm Transition Workbook or find any of the reference materials that we've put together, all you have to do is go to this website, agecon.okstate.edu/farmtransitions. I've been Shannon Farrell with the OSU Department of Ag Economics. Thank you for watching.